May 9th, 1945. HMS Formidable. 2 kamikaze strikes within 5 days. Total British deaths, 1 sailor. Operational again in 48 minutes. Same week, USS Bunker Hill. 2 kamikaze strikes. 389 Americans dead. Ship withdrawn from combat, never fought again. Same enemy, same weapon, same ocean, catastrophically different results. The Japanese had perfected their kamikaze tactics on American carriers. They knew precisely where to aim. They understood what happened when a Zero carrying 550 pounds of high explosive punched through a wooden flight deck into a hangar packed with armed aircraft. They'd already sunk 3 American escort carriers outright, crippled USS Franklin so badly 807 sailors died. The divine wind was working. American blood proved it. Then British Task Force 57 arrived with 4 armoured carriers, and every lesson the Japanese had learned turned out to be catastrophically wrong. An American liaison officer stood on HMS Indomitable's bridge, watching damage control teams sweep burning wreckage into the sea. The carrier had just survived 3 kamikaze attacks in 10 minutes. 0 British casualties. He threw his cap on the deck and stamped on it. American wooden deck carriers would be finished. The British officer smiled. Well, old boy, that's rather the point, isn't it? This is the story of how British engineering created carriers that could survive attacks no American ship could withstand. The story of armoured flight decks that turned kamikazes into what one historian called scrambled eggs. And why, when Admiral Spruance needed carriers for the most dangerous mission in the Pacific, he specifically requested the British, because he knew they wouldn't sink. The secret began 10 years earlier, 1935. The Mediterranean, Rear Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson commanded HMS Furious during the Abyssinian crisis. Italian bombers operated from airfields 200 miles away. The Mediterranean wasn't the vast Pacific. It was a shooting gallery, 900 miles long, 120 miles wide at its narrowest, surrounded by enemy airfields. Henderson watched RAF exercises. The doctrine was clear. The bomber will always get through. Fighters couldn't intercept every attack. He reached a conclusion American counterparts hadn't grasped. British carriers couldn't rely on not being hit. They had to survive being hit. The Americans were building carriers for offensive power. USS Yorktown, 809 feet long, wooden flight deck, 3 inches thick, 80 aircraft embarked, light, fast, devastating. Henderson was building carriers to survive. The Admiralty thought he'd lost his mind. You want the flight deck itself armoured? 3 inches of hardened steel across the entire 673-foot flight deck. Not underneath it. The flight deck itself. 14-ton armoured plates, serving as the ship's strength deck. Surround the hangar with 4.5-inch armoured bulkheads. It was considered impossible. The weight would make ships top-heavy. They'd capsize. Naval architect W. A. Forbes locked himself in his office for 3 months. 17 designs, 17 failures. Then Forbes had an audacious idea. What if the armour didn't just protect the ship? What if it was the ship? The 3-inch armour plate which formed the flight deck was used both for protection and longitudinal strength. That was the secret. The armour didn't add weight to the structure. It replaced structure. HMS Illustrious was laid down 27 April 1937. The 3-year design process compressed to 3 months. Henderson drove his staff mercilessly on 18-hour days, 7-day weeks. Henderson died in March 1939 from overwork-related illness. He was 56. He never saw his carriers prove themselves in combat. But by 1945, his legacy was steaming toward Okinawa. 4 armored carriers, HMS Formidable, HMS Victorious, HMS Indefatigable, HMS Indomitable. The Japanese pilots attacking them had no idea what they were about to discover. Easter Sunday, 1945:07:28 hours. HMS Indefatigable. 2 Seafire pilots caught the 400 yards out. Cannon rounds tore through the fuselage, ripping off aluminum skin. The aircraft disintegrated mid-air, but the pilot held his course. Wounded, dying, committed. The Zero looped over the island and dove. Impact, starboard side, 9 feet from the island, 550 pounds. Impact velocity, 307 miles per hour. The explosion killed 14 men instantly. The pilot's briefing room ceased to exist. The sick bay obliterated. Lieutenant Commander Pat Chambers, killed. Lieutenant Leonard T., killed. Dr. Alan Vaughan, killed. The flight deck depressed 3 inches over a 15-foot area, but the armor held. The bomb detonated against 3 inches of hardened steel, instead of penetrating to the hangar where 36 armed aircraft waited. 2 weeks earlier, USS Franklin took 2 conventional bombs through her wooden flight deck. They punched into the hangar where 31 armed aircraft were spotted. The explosions were so violent, the ship's 15-ton forward elevator was blown 300 feet into the air. 807 sailors died. Franklin never operated aircraft again. HMS Indefatigable lost 14 men to a direct kamikaze strike. Lieutenant Commander Sandy Sanderson was already moving. Crash barriers gone. Rig a replacement from number 3 arresting wire. Chief Petty Officer Jimmy Green was in the hangar with fire crews. The armored bulkheads contained the fire to a 20-foot section. Damage control teams swept wreckage overboard. They filled the crater with quick-setting concrete whilst under air attack. 08:16 hours. 48 minutes after a 550-pound bomb exploded on her deck, HMS Indefatigable landed her first sea fire. American liaison officers watched in silence. USS Franklin had been under repair for 2 months. HMS Indefatigable was landing aircraft before the hour was up. The Japanese weren't finished. May 4th, 1,131 hours. HMS Formidable. The Zero emerged from cloud at 8,000 feet, diving at 290 miles per hour. Anti-aircraft fire shredded the aircraft. It flew through it all. Impact, 9 feet starboard of centerline, junction of 3 14-ton armored plates. The bomb exploded, but fragments penetrated to an oil tank 30 feet below. Fire erupted. The center boiler room flooded with steam. Speed dropped from 24 knots to 18. 11 aircraft destroyed. 8 men killed, 47 wounded. The flight deck showed a 2-foot square hole and a depression 24 feet by 20 feet, up to 2 feet deep. 1,700 hours. 5.5 hours after impact, the flight deck was operational. Captain Philip Ruck-Keene signaled Admiral Vian, "Little yellow bastard." Vian's reply, "Are you addressing me?" 4 minutes later, 2 kamikazes targeted HMS Indomitable. 1,147 hours. The first Zero climbed to 3,000 feet, rolled inverted, dove at 60 degrees. Heavy fire set it ablaze. The pilot couldn't see. He belly flopped onto the armored deck at 280 miles per hour, skidded 90 feet, and bounced over the port side. His bomb exploded in the water. Burning fuel engulfed the flight deck in a 200-foot fireball. British casualties, 0. 1,155 hours. 8 minutes later, second Zero diving from 5,000 feet. HMS Quality and Indomitable's gunners opened fire. The Zero disintegrated and crashed 10 yards off the bow. HMS Indomitable survived 3 kamikaze attacks in 10 minutes. 0 casualties. Flight deck operational throughout. The American liaison officer suggested Indomitable return for repairs. The British officer looked confused. Whatever for? Your flight deck's covered in burning fuel. Oh, that should burn off shortly. The officer threw his cap down and stamped on it. American carriers would be finished. We'd be heading to Pearl Harbor for 6 months. The British officer smiled. Well, old boy, that's rather why we built them this way. May 9th. 1,656 hours. HMS Victorious. The Zero approached from astern at 260 miles per hour, just 50 feet above the waves. The pilot carried a 500-pound bomb with a delayed action fuse designed to penetrate before detonation. Captain Denny ordered a 25-degree turn. Too late. The Zero's wheels touched the deck. The undercarriage sheared off. The aircraft broke apart, skidding 80 feet. The bomb detonated. The impact created a 5-square-foot hole. The deck depressed 3 inches over 144 square feet. Aviation fuel lines ruptured. Fire erupted. 1,702 hours. 6 minutes later, second kamikaze struck with a glancing blow, destroying 4 corsairs, 4 killed, 19 wounded. Victorious was launching aircraft within 1 hour. 1,707 hours. HMS Formidable. Second kamikaze in 5 days. The Zero struck almost exactly where the previous kamikaze hit. The deck depressed 4.5 inches over 10 square feet. 6 corsairs and 1 Avenger destroyed. 1 killed, 8 wounded. A red flag warning system introduced after May 4th saved lives. Deck crew had 30 seconds to take cover. Flight deck operational in 48 minutes. The contrast with American carriers was devastating. May 11th, 1,945, USS Bunker Hill. 0905 hours. First kamikaze dropped a 550-pound bomb that punched through the wooden deck into the hangar. The bomb exploded among 34 armed aircraft. Then the kamikaze crashed onto the deck. 0907 hours. Second kamikaze crashed near the island. Parked aircraft ignited in chain reactions. Bombs cooked off. Rockets fired horizontally. Fire spread across 3 decks. Temperatures reached 2,000 degrees. 346 killed in action. 43 missing. 264 wounded. Total dead, 389 sailors. Bunker Hill was still under repair when Japan surrendered. Though fully repaired, the ship never operated aircraft again. 3 days later, USS Enterprise, the most decorated American carrier, met its combat end. May 14th, Lieutenant Shunsuke Tomiyasu used cloud cover to approach unseen. He snap-rolled inverted and dove through the forward deck at 310 miles per hour. The explosion sent the 15-ton forward elevator rocketing 400 feet into the air. 14 killed, 68 wounded. Enterprise withdrew from combat and never returned. The numbers are brutal. British carriers. Average 7 deaths per impact across 6 strikes. Total 28 killed, 101 wounded. Average return to operations 90 minutes. American carriers with armed aircraft on deck 100 to 400 plus deaths per strike. Average return, 2 to 6 months. Franklin, 807 dead, never operated again. Bunker Hill, 389 dead, never operated again. British 3-inch armor prevented penetration in 5 of 6 hits. American wooden decks were penetrated in 80 to 90% of strikes. Admiral Raymond Spruance understood what the numbers meant. April 8th, 1945. USS Hancock severely damaged. Formosa airfields were launching hundreds of kamikazes. Someone had to suppress them. American carriers were vulnerable. British carriers could take hits that would cripple American ships. Spruance specifically requested British Task Force 57 strike the Formosa airfields instead of American carriers. The highest-ranking American admiral in the Pacific sent British carriers on the most dangerous mission because he knew they could survive. Why were British casualties 95% lower? 4 reasons. First, penetration. American wooden decks offered zero resistance. Kamikazes punched into hangars where fuel and ordnance were stored. Secondary explosions killed hundreds. British armor initiated most bombs before they reached the hangar. Damage was contained above the armored box. Second, deck parks. Americans spotted 30 to 50 armed aircraft on deck. When kamikazes hit, chain reactions were apocalyptic. USS Franklin had 31 armed aircraft on deck. The explosions killed more sailors than the initial impact. British carriers operated smaller air groups, 36 to 54 aircraft, versus 80 to 110 American, and struck aircraft below between sorties. Third, fuel fires. Americans carried 240,000 gallons in open hangars with roll-up doors. Fires spread rapidly. Wooden structures burned readily. British carriers, 100,000 gallons maximum, in cylindrical tanks surrounded by seawater. Fuel lines purged with carbon dioxide. Enclosed armored hangars confined fires. Fourth, timing. Catastrophic American damage occurred when preparing to launch strikes. Decks packed with armed aircraft, ordnance being loaded, fuel systems pressurized, maximum vulnerability. British operational tempo was lower, with smaller air groups, fewer maximum vulnerability moments. Samuel Eliot Morrison, the official U.S. naval historian at Okinawa, watched kamikazes hit both fleets. His assessment: a kamikaze hitting a steel flight deck crumpled up like a scrambled egg and did comparatively little damage. The official U.S. Pacific Fleet report: without armored decks, Task Force 57 would have been out of action with 4 carriers for at least 2 months. But there was something wartime reports didn't mention. Something that only became clear years later. British carriers appeared invincible in combat. All 6 survived the war, but they were dying anyway. The armored box hangar created a massive void in the hull girder, under shock from near misses and kamikaze impacts. Hull girders deformed irreversibly. Hulls twisted, rippled. Structural damage, invisible from outside, but catastrophic. HMS Illustrious. Hull girder deformed 14 inches amidships. Scrapped 1,956. HMS Formidable. Scrapped 1,953. HMS Indomitable. Scrapped 1,955. HMS Indefatigable. Scrapped 1,956. Only HMS Victorious was rebuilt. 1,950 to 1,957, costing over £20 million, so expensive that planned rebuilds were cancelled. American carriers that suffered catastrophic topside damage remained structurally sound. USS Franklin, 807 deaths, 4,000-degree fires, structurally intact, served until 1964. USS Bunker Hill, 389 deaths, massive explosions, structurally sound, served until 1966. British carriers survived combat better, but couldn't survive the peace. American carriers suffered worse damage, but remained viable for 30 more years. Context matters. British Task Force 57 faced dramatically lower attack intensity. During Okinawa, US Task Force 58, with 15 carriers, destroyed 1,998 Japanese aircraft. British Task Force 57, with 4 carriers, destroyed 75. The Japanese launched 10 Kikusui mass attacks against American forces. None were directed at British carriers. Americans faced approximately 25 times the attack intensity. But when the war ended, the US Navy examined British design and reached a conclusion. They'd been wrong about armor. USS Midway class, 59,900 tons, with 3.5-inch armored flight decks. All subsequent American carriers featured armored flight decks. But Americans didn't just copy armor. They adopted 3 revolutionary British innovations. The angled flight deck, invented by Captain D. R. F. Campbell, Royal Navy, 1951, enabled simultaneous launch and recovery. USS Antietam received the first experimental angled deck in 1952. The steam catapult, invented by Commander C. C. Mitchell, 1946 to 1950, generated 90,000 pounds of thrust versus 55,000 for hydraulics. Could launch heavier aircraft. USS Hancock received the first operational steam catapult in 1954. Without steam catapults, the US Navy couldn't launch heavy jet bombers carrying nuclear weapons. British innovation proved critical to American Cold War strategy. The mirror landing site, invented by Commander Nicholas Goodhart, combined with angled decks, it enabled safe jet operations. 3 British innovations. Every modern aircraft carrier uses them. On Easter Sunday, 1945, American officers watched HMS Indefatigable take a kamikaze hit that would have crippled any American carrier. 37 minutes later, they watched that carrier land aircraft. They watched HMS Formidable take 2 kamikazes in 5 days and return to operations within hours each time. They watched HMS Victorious absorb 2 kamikazes in 6 minutes and continue fighting. They watched HMS Indomitable survive 3 kamikaze attacks in 10 minutes with 0 casualties. They watched British sailors sweep burning wreckage overboard whilst American carriers burned for days. The divine wind that crippled the US Navy met 3 inches of British steel and crumpled like scrambled eggs. 28 British dead across 6 kamikaze hits. Carriers operational in under 2 hours. Ships that refuse to sink, refuse to burn, refuse to quit. That's not propaganda. That's 3 inches of armoured steel doing exactly what Rear Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson designed it to do. Henderson never saw his carriers prove themselves, never saw HMS Indefatigable operational 37 minutes after impact, never saw American admirals specifically request British carriers for the most dangerous missions. He died in 1939, destroyed by the effort of revolutionizing carrier design. But on May 9th, 1945, when HMS Formidable took her second kamikaze and was operational in 48 minutes, Henderson's legacy proved itself in fire and steel. The Japanese never understood why British carriers wouldn't die. American observers could hardly believe it. The numbers don't lie. 28 British deaths versus thousands of American deaths. 90-minute repairs versus 6-month overhauls. Ships that kept fighting versus ships that went home. 3 inches of armored steel. That was the difference between survival and catastrophe. Between 28 deaths and 389 deaths. Between 48 minutes and 6 months. Admiral Henderson's revolutionary design. Naval architect Forbes's brilliant solution. British sailors sweeping wreckage under air attack. Not luck, not chance, not superior seamanship. 3 inches of armored steel doing exactly what it was designed to do: survive.